Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to the CMA and CMO Weekly Webinar Series. I am Jackie Lewis, VP of Content here at ARC, which is the parent association for CMA and CMA, and I am going to be the host for today's webinar. And when it comes to joint business planning, we all know that category advisors bring us a real source of truth to the table, fostering credibility and trust in the process. And today I am going to be hosting a panel discussion with guests and former sales and merchandising leaders from Walmart, Coca-Cola, and 7-Eleven as they share their perspectives on how category advisors can become the go-to partner by bringing the right data and insights to the table. Our presenters today are from Insite AI, an AI-enabled strategic advisory services and solutions firm tackling revenue growth and category management initiatives. Kristine, Joji, and Capri Brixey are both Executive Vice Presidents of Strategy Consulting. Former leader at Coca-Cola, Dr. Pepper Snapple, and Ahold Delhaize, Capri brings extensive strategic leadership experience from both retailer and supplier roles in the consumer goods industry. And Kristine is a highly accomplished retail executive and former VP of merchandising at Walmart. Kristine led strategic initiatives that resulted in sustainable revenue growth for the company across grocery and prior to that, personal care. So we have two phenomenal experts with us and panelists today that I cannot wait to dive into my prepared questions. So also, if you have any questions along the way, this will just be a discussion style. So please, we'd like some interactivity from the audience. As you have any questions for Kristine or Capri, please put those in the chat box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen at any point, and we are definitely going to save some time at the end to get through some of your questions as well as mine. And then finally, we will also be recording the presentation today. So if you miss something, don't worry, we'll be posting that recording in our resource library for all CMA and CMA members next week, and we will send you an email when it's been posted. So with that out of the way, welcome to you both. Do you want to just say a quick hello before I jump into my questions for the two of you?
Of course. Hello. Thank you for leading this. Looking forward to the discussion.
Love it. Awesome.
Super excited. So many panelists joining with us on a Friday. So thank you all for being here.
Exactly. We all know JBP is a hot topic when you get this good of a turnout on a Friday. You're right. So, all right, Kristine, I want to start off with you because your perspective as a former VP of merchandising at Walmart, let's just start off pretty high level. What are some of maybe the biggest mistakes that you see CPGs making in the JBP process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there's probably about 4 or 5 things that could really set the process awry in the very beginning. One of the most important parts of joint business planning is a true deep understanding of the strategy and the priorities of the retailer you're partnering with. So whenever we see suppliers entering a planning session with only their company's agenda, it can derail a conversation really quickly and lead to an unproductive meeting. I think once you have that deep knowledge of the retailer and what they're striving to achieve for the year, you can ensure that the plans that you and your team are developing truly align with those goals, and it'll make that conversation a lot more of a partnership conversation.
Great.
The next thing I would say would be agreement on the metrics that matter and the one version of the truth data source. So anytime you have people that are looking at different measures of success and what the data source is that they're using to measure that success, misalignment happens and it leads to a lot of confusion and frustration. So building a specific and timely tactical plan to deliver on those metrics and then following up post events will really help alleviate that confusion. Short-term planning. So during COVID, we were in a really VUCA environment, and we created a habit of working in these little short windows of time. So what's going to happen in the next 4 weeks or 6 weeks and 8 weeks? And we lost this muscle of long-term strategic planning. So while managing in short stints it's necessary, and for a period of time, it's really important, but it can't be the only thing that you focus on. So we're really needing thought leaders to start exercising that muscle and working towards not only short-term planning, but really mid and long-term business planning.
Great.
The last thing I would say would be connectivity between all functions and ensuring that people who have decision-making rights are at the table. So too often we see, for instance, like revenue growth management, brand, marketing, customer insights, data analytics, et cetera, brought in after discussions already started, and we find that they're not able to deliver on what the asks were. So the biggest thing is don't work in silos and bring your decision makers into meetings early and bring them often.
Super helpful. Love it. Thank you so much for that. All right, next let's turn over to Capri. So how would you define the role of a category advisor in the joint business planning process?
A category advisor is, I would just say very briefly, leadership and strategic planning. So building on Kristine's answers regarding the phases of planning and leadership in JBP, she talked a lot about understanding what the priorities are, making sure that what you're bringing to the table is aligned, and then talking about what you can go and do together. And a category advisor sees that whole with the data and the insights that they have and they bring to the table. Kristine also mentioned connectivity. So connectivity is where a category advisor brings all cross-functional partners to the table. They work with their sales teams to ensure that the process is being driven appropriately, but really planning forward and understanding all of those phases, bringing the right insights at the right time, driving the content, influencing all of the players involved, making sure that the decision makers understand what insights are the most valuable and how to effectively close that process and continue it even beyond the official meetings of joint business planning. The category advisor has a really important role in post-event analysis and bringing, keeping everybody aligned to whatever, if it's a scorecard or it's simply aligned metrics of success that you're going to work toward together. They have a responsibility to say, this is where we are. We're tracking this progress, and I'm going to bring you the insights, the results, the post-performance information that says we've done the right thing, or maybe we need to revisit. So their strategic leadership in this process is critical to a successful joint business planning process overall.
That's great. That's great. And I love, Kristine, you made the point about how during COVID, all the planning sort of just shifted to real time, tactical, operational, get product on the shelf. And so it's great to hear that, all companies are kind of breathing a sigh of relief and coming out of that finally, and really being able to do some of this long-term planning again, because it was so valuable. And I think it was such an important role of category advisors, in the past that it's great to see it's kind of come back around. So. That's great. Kristine, in your experience, what are the common challenges faced by category advisors in really establishing credibility and trust with their retail partners during JBP?
Yeah, I would say data and robust data, right? So I think that when you're trying to figure out like how do you build trust, and then how do you move it forward, bringing robust data and facts is a great way to build that trust and transparency. Telling the truth about what's working, and don't paint a rosy picture about what's not working. So let's say you took a price increase and you thought that there was elasticity, and instead you found that the customer traded out of the brand and moved into private brand. Or you launched new innovation and you thought it was going to be really incremental to the category, but instead you found out that 70% of the business was cannibalized by, or 70% of it was cannibalized by current items. Yeah. Your promotional strategy with marketing and shelf placement, you thought it was going to drive additional purchases or new customers, but you found that your basket size stayed the same. So bringing information forward and showing that you are data-led and insight-driven lets the retailer know that you are in the details of your business, that you understand the customer and the environment and what's happening now, and therefore what could happen in the future. And it really helps to build that confidence in you as a steward of the business.
That's great. I love that. I love that. Capri, I want you to weigh in too on this one. Establishing credibility. Do you agree? Anything you would add to that?
I do. I mean, obviously, first be credible, right? Yeah. And that goes back to, part of what Kristine just mentioned with bringing the insights that don't just make your brand have a rosy picture all the time.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I want to pick out of what Kristine just said was she just gave some really credible insights. Your product, you thought your product was going to do X, and instead it transferred, that demand transferred to another product, or it was cannibalizing another product that currently existed, or you thought it would be incremental to the category and it wasn't incremental to the category. Those are actual insights versus reporting the news. And often what makes us credible is our ability to go find that insight rather than simply say the category is up or the category is down, or volume is here and it was here last year, or dollars are X but they were Y last year. That is not an insight, that's the news. We can look at a piece of data and we can find what the news is. What we really need category advisors to do, and what the joint business planning process desperately needs, is true insights to say, this is what happened, this is why it happened, and this is what we should go do next. Even if it was, this is what we expected to happen, and it's not exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. So here's what we still project into the future as a result of taking a very close, incredible look, objective look at what happened in the category, either with what we said or with what the overall guidance for the category was, and truly bring insights to that process at every phase, whether it's at the beginning where you're really understanding what the priorities are, whether it is in the middle where you're figuring out how do we align our priorities, or if it's in the end as you're creating those real tactics and solutions to go drive the business together, and continuing as you're anchoring back to those key tactics, those key solutions, those key metrics of success that you were going to drive together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you also, as you were explaining that, didn't say the word storytelling, but it came out in the way you're describing what you do in this process, more so as we're not just reporting the news, we're not just telling facts, we're telling a story, like what is happening in the category and why is it happening. And if it wasn't going as planned, that's almost more powerful sometimes and more interesting sometimes to try and flex and figure out what to do about it. And I like too how, we're working on, interestingly, a piece of content for the CMA right now, a playbook for line review. So obviously different than JBP, but I'm hearing similarities in the fact that we're using this term of data is the great equalizer now in line reviews, and it's the same thing. Bringing data and insights to the table is or data to the table is kind of table stakes. We all sort of have the data, so it's more about the so what and what do you do about it, and what's going to be best for the category.
Well, what some of those similarities are too, are what you named in the beginning, being objective. That makes you consistent, competency, methodology matters. So the methodology that you would apply to a line review and getting those insights applies to joint business planning as well.
Exactly. I love it. I love it. All right, Chris. Oh, go ahead.
I love the call out of storytelling because that's exactly what it is. And this is another thing that I found during COVID. It's just one of those things that we really didn't have to do as much of, right? We weren't doing in-person meetings. There weren't as many line reviews. A lot of modulars were pushed and canceled. And so a lot of people haven't learned how to tell that story, right? So, as Capri said, data is just data, and anybody can run a report. I mean, hell, you can have them auto sent to you every Monday before 7 a.m., right? Yeah. The beauty in it is taking all of those pieces of data and then streaming together with the trends and the insights and saying, okay, here's what my theory was, here's what the data is, here's what I know what's happening, and then here's what we can go do about it, and leading people from that very beginning point of hey, it's a piece of data, through that journey into the end of here's what that so what is, and here's what my recommendation of what we can go do to mutually to grow our business, and then to overarchingly grow the total category.
100%, 100%. Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about maybe, Kristine, and you both can weigh in, I think would be interesting, but an example, can you share an example of maybe a very successful JBP that you went through, and what were those really key factors that led to the success of that?
Yeah. So over 20 years, I've definitely had some very successful joint business planning partnerships, and I was reflecting on the time that I spent when I was in the consumables division, and what really differentiated some of those relationships and partnerships versus the others. So one of the first things was pre-planning for the discussion, and this is where we would get together far ahead of actually the joint business planning process itself and the meetings and all those other things. But we would sit together and we would talk about what is the current state of the business? Where is the customer? Where is the industry? Where is the economy? And then where are we now? And then where are they going, right? So just having like a really good like state of the business, and then what does the future look like?
Yeah.
Then my supplier partners would actually go and do pre-alignment coming out of that with their internal team. So go back to revenue growth management and the brands and the marketing, and then partner with their insights and category and data teams and leverage that with the revenue growth management and brand marketing teams, and then interlay and weave in my strategy to do that internal selling to say, okay, here's what we know, here's where the retailer is going, and then here's what we need to be able to deliver to grow with them. Yeah. The third thing, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, was having the key decision makers in the room, those who could say yes or no at the table. There was nothing that shut down a session faster or created more frustration than an inability to move the ball forward. So you would sit in a 3-hour meeting and everybody felt really good, and then you'd walk out and then they're like, yeah, we can't do that. Or we'd be in that 3-hour meeting and somebody would say, yeah, I can't say yes to that. I really need to go talk to this person, or I need to go talk to this team. Let's have another meeting. We are busy. You are busy. Retailers are busy. You have to make sure that the time that you get with your retail partners is incredibly, it's productive. And the way to create that productivity is having those key decision makers in the room. It also lets the retailer know that you're prioritizing them, because you're getting those key decision makers coming in, and you're like, hey, we are a priority. We're going to be here for you. We want to hear what you say, and we want to partner directly. Mm-hmm. The last thing would be delivering on what was committed to. I think Capri said it earlier. It's like, be credible. So deliver on what you committed to. So if we sit down and we spend time with you building a very specific tactical plan that is, at the foundation, like built on a strategy, everybody can say, these are the things that we agreed to. These are the tactics that we agreed to, whether it's, shelf placement, pricing, promotions, the current just base run of the business, and then doing those quarterly checkpoints to ensure that we're still on track. Because retail is still retail, and you can't, say like, who knew that there was going to be, a war in Ukraine, and who could have prevented, COVID. There's always going to be things that happen. So having those quarterly checkpoints to say, if something came up for some reason, where are we, and then what do we need to go do to pivot to make sure that we can still deliver our plan together.
That's great. What a helpful though call out, that like have all the key decision makers in the room, because that's one you could easily overlook. I think like you get the meeting schedule, but thinking about the players and the people that need to be there, that is such a helpful sort of comment, that like if the decisions can't be made right then and you can move the ball forward, like it's just going to prolong it, right? And it's just going to be inefficient for people. So I think that was really, really helpful.
Yeah, and it was great because actually Capri and I were chatting about this before, and I think sometimes what we don't always take into consideration, and she mentioned this because she came from Coke, was what everybody else's schedule is. So as you're working, as your local teams are working with the retailer, you may not take into account, okay, well, if I need the chief customer officer coming in, I need to go work on his schedule, and then I have to go work on the brand manager's schedule, and trying to coordinate all of those schedules to get everybody into that meeting, once it's already been set, because usually the retailer sets it and then you're trying to get everybody else.
Yeah.
That creates a lot of points of consternation. So I think, Capri made a really great call out and saying, you need to work back and ensure that you're on the schedule and on the calendars for those key decision makers in enough time so that they can prioritize it and attend.
Love it. Yeah. Anything to add, Capri, from your end, or?
Of course. I think just building on that, the scheduling, and I was always the person saying plan again, plan ahead, put it on the calendar, move it. If you have to move it, move it. But at the beginning of the year, and this rigor applies not just to joint business planning, but frankly, it applies to every key anchor process that you need throughout your calendar year. So whether it's monthly business reviews, whether it's the quarterly check-ins post the immediate meetings within the joint business planning process, whether it is internal check-ins, whether it's calendar scheduling, whether it's using company assets, whatever it is, you want to put those anchor pieces on the calendar as quickly as you possibly can and think as far forward about this process as possible. Because, Kristine comes from a world where they were very ready for joint business planning. And that process was well known to them, and it was expected that they were going to go through that. So that's a muscle that those supplier teams are familiar with. Yeah. But not every channel has that same type of readiness. And to be honest, it is actually easier for suppliers when retailers are ready for the joint business planning process. That makes it easier to plan because there are aligned expectations for how the process will go, how many meetings there might be, what each of those meetings is going to include, and then the expectations, the continuing expectations of you must have the decision makers in the room. This is what we expect as outputs of the meeting, the actions that you will take to align key stakeholders internally and externally throughout that process are all the hurdles that you go through because you already know how the process should play out. But every channel has a slightly different set of readiness in terms of their retail partners. And I liken it to negotiation training. If anybody's ever been through negotiation training, they often tell you, intuitively you think it's better if you've been through negotiation training and the person on the other side of the table has not been. But in fact, that's not true. You will have better results if both parties have been through negotiation training because you're both speaking the language. And the same is true of joint business planning. So if you are in the position where you are working with a retailer who is unfamiliar with the process, or it is not a process that they typically go through, or they reserve it for a very few vendors and they don't necessarily go through it each year, then the onus is on the supplier to lead that process very definitively. Stake out your phases, understand and align expectations throughout the entire process. Bring the retailer along with you and you drive the rigor in that process. And planning ahead is key to that. Mm-hmm. The key components are those aligned expectations at every single stage of joint business planning. And if you don't bring insights, you will not bring value. So align your expectations and make sure that there's a value proposition in joint business planning. It's not just an opportunity to get together at the table and talk. There have to be real outputs to each of those discussions and that entire process. So define for yourself first, what is the value that we seek to achieve? And then go truly care about this process and listen throughout it. And at the end of it, you have cared enough about the retailers, your partners, goals and priorities as much as about your goals and priorities that you will truly have a plan that you can both align to. The entire point is to drive collaboration. And if you are not weighing mutual growth, mutual priorities throughout the process, and you are not planning ahead, then you will know there are always things that can derail it, to Kristine's point. There can be world events that derail what your goals were, but being able to be agile and working through that process and knowing where you want that finish line to be and then planning toward it, key components to success in the process.
Love it, love that. And what a great segue for me to mention that in the chat box for all of our attendees, check that out. Insite AI has a JBP readiness assessment tool that they will make available to anybody that's on the call that's interested. So check that out. I have a feeling some of the things Capri was mentioning are things that are on that readiness assessment checklist, I can imagine, and or helping you prep for your next JBP, right? So that's great. Yeah. All right, let's move on to some solutions, some data.
I want to add on one more thing, because I love what Capri says. When we were talking about, those successful joint business planning partnerships that I had in the past, one of the things that I didn't mention is what you will find is, as a retailer, when you have a strategic, thoughtful, insight and data-driven supplier partner who is showing not only growth for themselves as a brand, but also growth in the industry and is showing themselves as a leader, you give them more time. You give them more meetings. Their insights have more weight because they are credible. They've been trustworthy. And you will lean on them more because they are, again, factually driven, data driven, they deliver what they commit to. And those are the people, as opportunities start to come up, it's like, oh my gosh, I have this opportunity on the mod, or have this opportunity with a marketing campaign. Those are the people that you will hearken back to, and you will go and say, hey, I have this opportunity, you know, based on the insights and data you delivered, I think that this might work for it. Can you go talk to your team and see if it's available? So once you build that rapport and the credibility and the trust, as somebody who is deeply rooted into what the customer is doing, what the industry is doing, and what the business is doing, you will give them more time, and you will give them more opportunities.
Yeah, and advisorships, captaincies, a lot of that is awarded based on the folks that have the most shopper insights, you know, and data available to share back with the retailer. So it kind of piggybacks on what you're saying there too. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move to the data, because we're talking about, you know, we want as much data as we can. Data is the great equalizer, you know. So what are some of the data challenges that retailers typically face during JBP? Is it like contradictory data points? Is it too much data that you can't get through it all? Like, so maybe let's talk about that and how category advisors can address these challenges and make sure they're providing you with the right data and insights that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I can kick off, and then I'm sure Capri will jump in as well. The biggest challenge that exists is understanding what the one version of the truth data source is, and then ensuring that we were all looking to and speaking to the same data. So a great example, like I come from Walmart. If Walmart's using Luminate data, you need to ensure that you are using the same data points, because if you're not, Walmart's going to be saying, this is the data source we're using. The supplier will be saying, well, we looked at this, we used this household data or whatever, and it's showing this. And we're like, we don't care, because that's not the data source. That's not what we're looking at. And you spent all this time putting together your story and your plan based off of a piece of data that nobody is going to, it's not going to resonate with anybody. So I think that single and aligning early on what that one version of the truth data source is will save you a lot of headache and heartache.
Yeah.
The next thing I would say is, what are the metrics that matter? And this happens a lot, and it's actually happened a lot within the last 2 years, especially during COVID, is what are the metrics that matter? And if you find that one person is really excited about driving top line growth, and for their company, top line sales growth is the most important thing, but for the other person, units are the most important thing. One may be super excited because they're like, hey, we're delivering on our goal, but the other was like, yeah, but you didn't deliver on the units, so that's not success. So the metrics that matter on top of the one version of the truth data source are going to be the things that are super important. And then lastly, and I want to say this again, repetition is the key to learning, and Capri mentioned before, data is still just data. And retailers want to understand the why and then the so what. Because I said earlier, anybody can pull a report. The beauty is the storytelling, and it's taking those numbers, overlaying and integrating the insights, the trend, the data and analytics, and then helping people understand what is happening so that they can go and formulate a plan on what to do next.
Yeah.
Yep, and I'll add to that. And I think, Jackie, you said something. You said we all want more data. And this is part of the reframing I think that we need to just do overall, is that answered and received. We have more data every day than we had yesterday. Yes. And it inundates us. There's almost too much data for us to reasonably take in and understand. It's not that we need more data, it's that we need to do better with the data that we're receiving. We need new ways to leverage it, which is why the news isn't enough. The data is the news, right? Yeah. We need those insights that stitch that data together in ways that tell us, what should we go do next? Okay, I understand that our performance was X. What do we go do about it? What are the right things that will drive the category? So I would say to category advisors, empower the entire process. Lead, listen, discover. And I asked Kristine this yesterday. If you've ever been upset when someone asked you, what are your metrics of success? What are the pieces of data that you care about the most? And what is your single source of truth? And Kristine said, of course, no. And feel free to answer that now, Kristine, but
yeah,
go ahead.
We loved it when people asked us that. We loved it because at the end of the day, that meant that they wanted to understand and they were listening to us, right? So we love it when people ask us questions like, what is the most important thing to you? What are your metrics of success? What do you have to deliver this year? And then once they knew that, they were able to go partner to help us deliver the goals. So we absolutely love it when people ask that.
Yeah. Discovery is not just saying that too, but it's also saying, hey, look, I found this thing. Does this align with what you've seen in the data? And if it doesn't, why? What's the explainability, the methodology behind that? All of that just makes you more credible, and it makes you better with the data and the insights that you have available to you. I mean, driving that kind of discovery and then going back and iterating, that iteration is the JBP process. I mean, the entire JBP process is based on, okay, my understanding, Kristine, is that your metric of success is X. For me, my metric of success may be Y. How do I align those together and find the insights between those two metrics of success where we can drive mutual growth along both of those metrics if they're different? Control the controllables. Now you know what the controllables are. That's what the data serves to do, is tell us what the controllables are, and then the insights help us understand, what do we go do about it? What can we control based on what we couldn't control in the data? So the JBP process is very much about controlling the controllables and bringing everybody to the table and asking questions all along the way. And that is part of the data challenge. You have to understand what's the most important data. What are the best metrics of success? You can only get to that through discovery and true listening. And then as you create tactics or resolutions or plans together, continuing to go back to that data and validating, is this what you're seeing? This is what we're seeing. Here's how we got there, explaining it. That is the only way to get through a credible JBP process.
Yeah, that's great. Very well said. And I see a question come in, so please feel free to enter any questions for our audience members here in the chat box in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. We'll go through one or two more of my prepared questions, and then we'll switch over there. So if you have something burning as you listen to the conversation, please add it now. So I want to hear about what happens when you have an unreceptive partner who doesn't want to align. Maybe we'll start with Capri on this one. What is your recommendation when one of the partners kind of starts to veer off course or has veered off course?
So I mentioned before that there are different states of readiness within different retailers, and Kristine mentioned that there's different levels of readiness within supplier partnerships as well. And so a lot of that comes back to, how did you plan through it? How do you adjust, and what is your level of agility within the process? And you simply have to adjust some of your goals. But going back to that discovery and trying to truly drive collaboration, that is how you get through an unreceptive partner. There are always going to be times where it can be derailed, whether that's from events outside of your control, whether it's derailed because of negotiation. Sometimes things have to stop down and collaboration is not the goal. Kristine mentioned before that COVID drove us into more short-term planning. Things like very tactical negotiations can drive the JBP process into a tactical short-term view instead of a collaborative long-term strategic planning. So you often have to have your partnership on either side of the desk in a place where you can and you are willing to collaborate. So those things can result in derailment. And often the lack of receptivity is really just a problem that had to be solved to get to the table to begin with. And sometimes those have to be resolved first, and sometimes you can actually drive resolution to some of those problems through a more strategic view together and say, listen, if we can align on the big goals, we will definitely get to alignment on the smaller goals or the more tactical operations. So I would just say, keep the prize in mind and always value the size of the prize for both sides. Like, if we can get to resolution either on this small thing or this big thing, this is what both of us can win together. It goes back to aligning and creating solutions for each other. But I would really have the same question for Kristine.
Yeah, so I'll do the first one first, which is like if you have an unreceptive partner. I would say start with just the basics, which would be create a short-term tactical plan built on the retailer's priorities. And even if the retailer hasn't shared that with you directly what their strategy is, you should be able to glean a lot from their earnings releases and current business performances. So I would create a short-term tactical plan and then deliver on what you said you would do in that short-term tactical plan. And that will be the beginning of trust and credibility. So I'd say that's the best way if somebody's just not wanting to partner.
Yeah.
The second thing is if someone veers off course. Well, that's kind of retail, right? So in 20 years, I have never seen a plan go off without a hitch. It feels like the A-Team for me. Like, I don't know if anybody know what that show is. You might all be too young. But they would come up with the most like well thought out, collaborative, timely plans, and without fail, something would go wrong and they would have to pivot and find a way to make the plan come together. And inevitably in retail, something is going to happen. And whether it's a lid shortage or a container that fell into the ocean or a wildfire that breaks out in the Pac Northwest, or even if it's just so much as the retail's marketing strategy and campaign strategy changed to what you thought it was going to be, and the products and items and plans that you thought were going to be the priority no longer are. What I always say is bad news should travel faster than good news. And we always say, come up with a plan B, not just an idea of hey, this could work, but a plan B that you've started at least vetting internally and that could be viable, because things are going to happen. But if you want the partnership and the trust and the credibility, let them know, hey, we had a lid shortage. It's not great. We said we were going to deliver this new innovation or this promotion, and we can't do it now. And it's going to create a $50 million gap in our plan that we created together for Q2. But what I can do is I've partnered back with my revenue growth management team and with our marketing team, and we're going to be able to actually do this instead, right? And whether that's, a rollback on something or pricing on something or a promotion or specific marketing campaign, and that will help us close our $50 million gap. That's what you do, because things are going to go awry. Just have a plan on how you can partner together to continue in that joint value creation.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. And a question came in that's a little bit related to veering off course. So I'm going to serve it to you guys now. This person seems to have some challenges creating a sense of urgency. So are there any, recommendations that you guys can see or that have worked in the past, whether it be sense of urgency on the manufacturer side or the retailer side, that you can share to maybe help this person out if they're struggling with that?
So I'll jump in and take that one, because I did mention readiness and it being different depending on the channel or the set of retailers that you're working with. It can often be very different. There are some that are best in class with JVP and they want to help drive that process with you. And there are others that really are just not in a space where that's a muscle that they exercise or a process that's familiar to them. They don't have a standard operating procedure that includes joint business planning with their suppliers. And that's okay. Joint business planning can look like a number of different things. But again, if you go back to the beginning of the year where I said plan, 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 you're also setting your goals for yourself, for your account, for what you want to deliver as a team together. So in reaching those goals, joint business planning is just one piece of that process. So what it looks like for you with your retailer may be very different from something that looks like a formal JVP. But the purpose of it is to discover, to listen, to create a plan together, to align with them continuously. So whether you have the key decision makers throughout each organization in the room, or you end up achieving those goals directly with the person that you're dealing with all the time. Yeah. You can still create a plan to achieve that, and you can still keep those goals in mind, whether it's a formalized joint business planning process or it's relatively informal. Yeah. But in terms of motivating a retailer to work with you, setting those goals with your buyer, setting those goals with your merchant first, and then talking about how to align throughout both of your organizations and those key decision makers and stakeholders is a way to say, to cement success or the possibility of success. Because if I can align my key internal stakeholders and you can align your key internal stakeholders, then we will have support pervasively throughout our organizations for us hitting the goals that we've set together. And the only way we can do that is to drive that interaction with those key decision makers and get them at the table. So this is when my decision maker is available. This is when my leadership is available. This is when, and then align on that and have both parts of the organization that are now aligned to success in this process. Whether we call it joint business planning or not, what we're really trying to do is align both organizations to mutual goals. That's the entire point of joint business planning. So you don't have to call it joint business planning, but get those decision makers in the room through a formal or informal process and just be persistent about the fact that it is goal setting and alignment.
Yeah, I got this one a lot at Walmart for a lot of, and honestly, I don't know that there's one single reason why you're not getting the prioritization or the time. So I'll just give you a couple of the ones that I experienced in my time. Number one, I would say the reason that suppliers wouldn't get responsiveness is because they may not have been a priority. And the reason they may not have been a priority supplier is because they're not aligned to the goals. They're not delivering on the basics, right? So if you're not delivering the core in stock and basic, insights and analytics, you're not delivering on your sales, your communication and your teams aren't great, they're not going to see you as somebody that they need to invest a bunch of time with, right? So you figure, I'm going to use Coke because Capri was from Coke. Coke would come to a retailer and they're like the only retailer that they would work with for that team may just be, Target, Walmart, whoever it may be. But as a retailer, you have 85 different brands. And if you have 85 different brands, you have to prioritize your time with the brands that are going to be very aligned to what your strategies are, like deeply aligned. They're bringing insights and analytics and they're making themselves a valuable partner because like Capri said, it's like, why should they spend time with you? Well, if you bring something differentiated than everybody else does, there's a reason for them to spend time. The third thing is that you're innovative, right? You're listening to the goals, but you're innovative and you're bringing, different plans and ideas to the building, to the retailer. If you're not doing any of those things, you may not rise to the top of like, I need a sit down meeting with you and your leadership team. So I would say the first thing is if you want to get time is it kind of goes back to those things that we talked about at the top. Do you understand what the strategies and the priorities are? Do you understand where you are compared to the rest of the landscape? Are you delivering on those strategies? Because if you're not, nobody's going to give you a meeting. It's just not going to happen.
Yep.
The second thing that I would say would be the communication. And I would get a lot of emails from people saying, hey, I'm not getting responsiveness from your team or I'm not getting this happening. And I'd be like, send me the communication, I want to see it. And I would see that people would be sending novels. And I'm like, they have 365 emails that they're getting through. You can't send a novel to somebody. You have to have very efficient and effective communication that you're sending so that people know, okay, like in the headline, this is what it's about. I need a follow-up. And most people read in a reading pane. So if you can't read it in the reading pane with bullet points of like what you need, people are like, oh my God, I don't have time for this. I'll just read it later. And it just keeps getting pushed further and further down. So clear, concise, effective communication is going to be the next one. And then the last is just going to be, what is your current state of the relationship? Because if you don't have a great relationship with that retailer, you're going to have to step back and push a pause button and say, why is our relationship not great, right? Like what is happening? And then what do we need to do to change that so that I can get meetings or I can get better responsiveness. And I'm saying this more from a higher level, not necessarily merchant, direct sales lead. I'm talking DMM, SVP, EVP and above, right? If your core relationship as a supplier and that retailer is not in a great place, you're going to have to step back and say why. And then you're going to have to do some of that trust and transparency and honesty and say, look, I know we're not in a great place. I want us to reset. Here's what I think is going on. I'd love from your point of view, also what's not going on. And then let's try to find a way to reset so that we can keep moving forward.
Exactly.
Those would be some of the broader things. Like I'd have to talk specifically like with what it is, but those are generally the things that would cause people not to respond to meetings, not get invited into a joint business planning process, etc. And I don't want anybody on this call to hear that it's, hey, if I'm not a top 10 CPG, then I'm not going to get invited in, because, you know, we would take some of our smaller, you know, the kind of second tier, and we'd say we wanted to develop them to be that next generation. And because they've come with great insights, great plans, great innovation, great thought leadership, we're going to invite them into that plan, into that joint business planning process, and we're going to elevate them and grow them to be the next big thing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I know we are running up on time, and I see some folks signing off. So I want to be respectful of that, especially on a Friday, right? So, but great conversation. What a quick 45 minutes, you know, and it flew by. So thank you both so much just for the, you know, the really helpful tips and tidbits from all of the JBPs that you've participated in. What a wealth of knowledge. So any final comments before we close it out for the day?
I'll just say thanks to everybody for joining us on a Friday. I really appreciated the time and the discussion. Influence is not about your title. Influence is about your behaviors, and it's about what you bring to the table. So anyone at any point in this process can be a leader and an influencer in this process or any other. So I would just end with bring the foundational behaviors to the table, and you will find that relationship in a spot where you can plan together and collaborate and find mutual growth.
That's great. I love that. And as a reminder too, in the chat, there's a JBP readiness assessment from Insite AI and instructions on how to get access to that if you'd like to go through that checklist and see if you're ready for your next JBP. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.